In today's Cutter Consortium webinar, Robert Charette will take an in-depth look at where enterprise risk management has been, where it is today, and where it needs to go if it wishes to become relevant to organizations today and, more importantly, tomorrow. Dr. Charette is a Cutter Fellow and the Director of Cutter's Enterprise Risk Management and Governance Practice, which has consistently led the industry in predictions and forethought around risk management and the impact on world events in the global marketplace. He is also president of Atabi Corporation, a business and technology risk management consultancy. With 35 years' experience in a wide variety of international technology and management positions, Dr. Charette is recognized as an international authority and pioneer regarding IS, IT, and telecommunications risk management. Dr. Charette serves as a senior risk advisor to Global 100 CEOs, CFOs, and program and project manager. He is a trusted risk advisor to senior-level defense, civil, and local government officials worldwide on the effectiveness, impact, rewards, and risk of their high-tech programs and policies. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Mark. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Can you tell me, Mark, if you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Mark was talking about getting cut off, and unfortunately I got cut off just before we started, so I want to make sure that we're all connected again. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the intro. Actually makes me sound like I actually know what I'm talking about. And hopefully with this presentation I'll be able to get people to think about risk management in a slightly different way. It's been unfortunately a fascinating week for the general topic of risk management and enterprise risk management in particular. It's also been a week that has set really in sharp relief today's presentation, and it's one that I finished up last week, and as you'll see, what happened in Japan isn't in the presentation, and it shows kind of what a major theme of the presentation is how events have really driven enterprise risk management and has highlighted this idea of the enterprise risk management paradox, which I'll explain in just a few minutes. If we take a look at a report that was published last year, and it's online, you can get it. It's called Globalization and Risk for Business. It's a Lloyd's of London report from July. And it talks about this idea of the risk crossroads, where globalization in all its forms has caused what we previously were considering independent and unrelated risks and now become interconnected and interlinked, as well as more complex and systemic. And if we take a look at what's happened in Japan, that's really come to fore as corporations worry about their supply chains, where people themselves are worried about whether or not they have a home to go back to. Economies, if you take a look at the markets, they're up, down, they're every which way. The risks that have presented with the radiation issue, along with just the impact of natural disasters, is causing a major rethink today of risk management. While that's happening, we're also in this position where we're kind of what I wrote, what I termed jumping the walrus, which for risk management, although people have recognized the need for risk management and enterprise risk management in particular, we're kind of in the situation that's highlighted by a lawsuit that's winding its way through the courts in the U.S., having the concern with the Madoff fraud and scandal, where within the lawsuit itself, I just picked out this one little section of it, which talks about the emperor has no clothes, has nothing on at all, said the little child from the emperor's new clothes, while J.P. Morgan, which is being sued for this $6.4 billion from the Madoff trustee, back in 2007, internally the risk management organization and the risk officers were looking and saying, you know, this guy is making a lot more money. We can't figure out how he's making his money. We think it's a fraud, but that information doesn't stop J.P. Morgan from underwriting Madoff and making tens of millions, I think $280 million or thereabouts, themselves, and selling this fraudulent material, fraudulent securities. Now, here we have the situation, and we've seen it with the financial crisis, we've seen it across the board, where enterprise risk management may have been done, but no one was paying attention to it, or it was used, in fact, to justify taking risks that really weren't warranted. And yet, this is from an article from the Financial Times of London about 2.5 weeks ago, where in it, it talked about this, the article title was Call Over Risk Officer Pay, and it was talking about how do you pay chief risk officers and folks in the risk department money to keep them honest as well as to give them that advice of being able to say that the emperor has no clothes for the enterprise, is that the enterprise risk manager is really able to anticipate the next big challenges and able to make the right decisions. That's going to be very valuable. So on one hand, risk management has been trashed. And in fact, we wrote a special issue for IT Cutter Journal back in, I believe, in 2002, which warned about risk management being oversold, to at the same time a recognition that it's a very valuable thing to have if you can do it properly, which kind of brings us to this enterprise risk management paradox, where business is not able to live without enterprise risk management. And again, what's happened last week, really shows that. But not being able to live with it either, because it really isn't producing value. So there's a lot of, schizophrenia, if you want, in terms of thinking about the value, but at the same time worried that it's a waste of time. So how did we really get ourselves into this situation, into this paradox? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm first going to talk about what is enterprise risk management. Just going to give a very brief outline of that. And again, there's papers in quantity at Cutter that talks about enterprise risk management and all the subdisciplines that you can access. How did the concept develop? Why has it failed and failed to especially live up to its expectation? And how can one pick up the pieces? And I'm going to talk about a company that I've been dealing with for over 20 years, which I think is still the prototypical organization for enterprise risk management and being able to do it well. So what is enterprise risk management? Well, it's a very simple notion on one level. It's the dynamic management of risk across the enterprise as an integrated discipline. And I use this kind of diagram with all the different connections of looking at how all these different competing risks and independent risks and coupled risks are all kind of managed together as on a level playing field. And risk, I'm just going to use as a definition as an event, situation, a circumstance that creates a potential material problem. It means something to the company or to the organization, and it's a possibility of a deviation from an expected outcome or event. That's just a general approach, and what we're thinking about is the differences between opportunities, risks, and problems. And we're trying to manage, in essence, those that triplet across the enterprise in a holistic fashion. It's a fairly easy definition and easy thought, although, again, in practice, it's quite a bit more difficult. And what does it integrate? Well, it integrates a number of different things. It integrates something which we call strategic risk management, which is where the organization is going. What's its direction? And how do we really look at it from a market or an enterprise view in terms of how do we allocate our strategic resources? There's also the operational risk management element, which has to do with people, processes, and technologies that are needed to carry out what we're trying to do from a strategic standpoint. There's financial risk management, which has to do with how do we allocate those resources, what's the value that's produced by those, as well as how do we make money on our money, part of the treasury function. We worry, too, about insurance risk management, which is really how do we deal with pure risks, things that we can't really manage or outside our control, and where we can try to financially manage those or transfer those to third parties. Now, some that are kind of cross-cutting to those four, which are also interrelated in and of themselves, things like crisis management. What happens when some event occurs and it's outside the norm, outside our normal risk management? Or again, companies today are practicing that in spades. There's also social risk management, which is kind of an old-fashioned that's become new again, a new area of risk management, and that has to do a lot today with social media, but also how the company is viewed, its reputation, which is also partly linked back to our strategic risk management and our operational risk management. So each one of these, although I talk about them as separate disciplines, are really interrelated in themselves, which again makes this a bit more complicated, because how do I make the call on risk if it's an operational risk that turns into a strategic risk, which also turns into a financial risk and creates a social risk. So these things get very complicated. Now, government views enterprise risk management, I won't say exclusively, but in large part as governance, something that has to do with how the organization is managed and from a board of directors or an executive board point of view. And it views it as this element of governance. And a lot of this view is because of what happened with corporate problems with Enron and others during Starbucks, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Now, one of the latest thrusts over the last 5 to 7 years has been this idea of linking governance, risk, and compliance, and that means really taking a look at how the board manages the corporation, but also in terms of compliance with government regulations, especially here in the U.S. with Starbucks, with in the U.K. and in Europe with things like the Turnbull requirements for compliance and governance, and trying to link all three of those because, again, it becomes very hard. And as I said, the concept in itself is fairly obvious. When we take a look at things today, of course you should be managing your strategic, operational, financial, insurance, social risks all as a whole. And, you can show a simple diagram on how these different things overlap in kind of this Venn diagram where if you start in the center and you have corporate governance, it has executive management and worry about the board. You have the audit committee, which looks at compliance. And then you have things like IT governance, which also covers some of those areas, but then goes out to the enterprise itself. You have compliance, which has to do, again, with the board and the audit committee, along with your outside auditors, your independent auditors, along with the government. And then you have enterprise governance, which has all those things or parts of it, but also has to worry about the day-to-day management. So in a nutshell, you have this kind of troika of governance, risk, and compliance. Well, it seems pretty obvious today, but it wasn't so obvious when you really start to track back to the ideas of modern risk management. And where did governance, risk, and compliance, where does ERM come from? Well, as the former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan used to say, events, dear boy, events. And again, what's happened this past week highlights that idea once more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the next couple of slides, and I'm going to go fairly quickly, so you're going to have to try to keep up, is list some of the major events, not all of them by any means, that kind of have driven enterprise risk management. And I'm going to try to link ENIAC on the left with the social unrest that's going on the right in the Mideast. And so if you'll be ready, we're going to go off on a quick tour of somewhere around 80 events that have helped define enterprise risk management. And as I said, number one is the ENIAC, starting off with the whole idea of modern-day computing and the movement of information and the control of information throughout organizations. And that has, of course, if you take a look at risk management, the very first, you have three root causes, basic root causes of risk: lack of information, lack of control, and lack of time. And ENIAC helped start managing all three of those from a whole different perspective than we could before. In 1948, we have somebody called Norbert Wiener, who is the father of cybernetics, and he starts looking at defining in formal terms this whole idea of systems theory, how different elements of systems all interconnect. Following that, we have kind of the insurance companies. Now, insurance companies have been around for a long time, but in the 1950s, we now start to see this idea that maybe insurance is more than just a reactive approach. It really has to do more with thinking about, well, maybe we should actively manage our risk. So there's some thinking about risk management as an organizational process and discipline. Now, while that's going on, in 1949, I'm showing this V2 rocket. Well, in 1949, we have the whole beginnings of the post-war technology challenge as well as the Cold War challenge. And that in 1949, we now are able to start launching rockets that have suborbital elements like satellites, so that now, again, we're starting to think about risk from a technical standpoint. That comes home to roots a little bit more in 1954 with number 5, with the disintegration of the Comet aircraft, the UK BOAC aircraft, which starts to highlight this idea of fatigue in metals. And now we're starting to take a look at systems and reliability. The whole notion of modern reliability really comes to the fore in a technical area. Number 6 is, you can't read it probably, but that's the headlines about a crash in the Grand Canyon where you have a mid-air collision between two aircraft, which is horrendous, and really pushes the need for having the air traffic control system in the U.S. and elsewhere, and having it now become integrated and under a massive control scheme where before it was basically visual flight rules outside the major airports. So now, again, how do we manage risk in an integrated environment? Number 7, well, here again, this is in 1956 is the 10th anniversary of the Strategic Air Command. And again, now we're talking about, again, through the Cold War and with things like the DEW line and others, massive military systems that require a whole different view of trying to manage the technical risks, which brings us to number 8 and Vernon Gross, who really is one of the earliest folks in trying to deal with technical risk. He has a brilliant book that he wrote many, many years ago called Managing Risk, which I'd encourage anyone to get, which talks about how do you think about technical risk from many different ways and how do you actually prioritize those. Number 9 is a person called Felix Kloman, who is really kind of the father of risk management, of integrated risk management from the insurance perspective. And Felix really started to look at, well, how does insurance risk get connected to financial risk and get connected to strategic risk? Number 10, well, in 1957, well, you know, now we're talking about really the idea of some integrated computing going on, and really the forefront of the forerunners of the IBM 360. We're now getting technology. 57, for instance, was the year that Fortran was released, and we're now talking about moving from assembly code to more higher level languages in computing and spreading computing throughout corporations from a business standpoint. In number 11, we have digital, also in 1957 starting, and again, changing how computing ought to be looked at, not only at these large mainframes, but now spreading through kind of the mid-range and into smaller departments. Also in 57, I should mention, is Peter Drucker writes his book, Landmark of Tomorrow, which talks about the knowledge worker and how that information, how work is going to change for folks, and it's being driven by companies like IBM and digital. Number 12, you have the FDA and the Delaney Clause, which just changes completely the whole idea of environmental risk and cancer-causing agents and what we should be concerned about and what we eat and what we grow. Also, during the 50s, you have Milton Friedman, who attacks basically the core economic thinking that has driven countries pre-war and post-war by pushing the whole idea of the free market, and that whole changes that concept changes what we think about risk and responsibility for individuals, corporations, and government. Some of that's shown in that cartoon 14, where you have the CEO talking to his board, and everybody saying, you know, is this everybody is in agreement, and everybody says yes, 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 and in the background we got to be kidding, you know, this is stupid, you know. Idiotic idea, but again, no one challenging it, which again is part of the driving factors between asking these questions about, well, what really is going on? Is it, you know, these large conglomerates, and are they, you know, this idea of social risk and responsibility? Over in 15, in 71, you got Intel starting, and again, once again, changing the ground in computing and where computing is going to go. 16 is an interesting book, if you can still find it, from 1973. Talks about the equity funding scandal, which was the first real big-time use of computing to create fraud, massive fraud. It was an insurance company set up all these Potemkin people and villages where they were able to rip off insurance companies for a fairly long time by collecting on selling insurance policies to people who only existed in the computer. Very interesting, but also started to take a look at how computers could be used to in crime in a big way. In 1973, you got Fisher Black and Myron Scholes, the Nobel Prize winners, coming up with this idea of pricing options, and just re-changing tremendously the whole idea of financial risk and financial risk management for corporations. Also in 73, if you don't recognize that symbol, it's our friends from OPEC. And 73, we have the first major oil embargo that occurs, and again changes corporations and everyone's view of, well, what's our dependency and how is risk globally interconnected. Moving on, this period of 74 to 93, where we move from leverage buyouts to chief risk officers. Well, Michael Milken, big time junk bond dealer, takes what Black and Scholes have come up with and figures out ways of taking that information and funding companies. While at the same time, T. Boone Pickens, who you probably have seen on television commercials, at least here in the States, pushing wind power. Oh, back in the late 70s, early 80s, he's the massive takeover artist and taking apart corporations, looking for value by changing again the value of risk within companies. 21, I got Microsoft in 1974 starting, and again changing the direction of how risk is managed and new sources of risk in terms of personal computing. 22, well, we got something that's related to what's happening today. We have 3 Mile Island that happens in 1979, and that nuclear scare and the massive impact on the nuclear power industry since then. In 23, I didn't realize it was this old, but in 1982, the book In Search of Excellence, again, changes. This really kind of starts the quality movement in the United States by taking a look at, well, what makes companies successful. 24, we have this what's called the Little Red Book if you're in the risk management field. Really the first real book on risk management published by the National Research Council, which really starts to say, well, how should the government manage risk? What are the processes? Really starting to formalize a lot of thought that's occurring out in the academic as well as practitioner field. 25, we have Bhopal, the Bhopal incident in India. And again, looking at corporate responsibility for what it's doing overseas, not only as in 3 Mile Island, what's happening to industries in the United States. 26, we got the Macintosh, and again, Apple changing how we view things, and what is computing and what's personal computing, and putting a PC on your desktop, and what that really means, and again, looking at how information is used. In 27, in 1985, we got Michael Porter just changing the notion of strategic risk management and strategic operations and strategic planning and getting people to think about things differently. The following year, in 86, we have the Challenger explosion. I served on a National Academy of Sciences review panel looking at Challenger, and again, it just changes tremendously how risk is managed within organizations, this whole notion of risk communication and thinking about it. 1987, the Wall Street crash, and again, people just not understanding what that did, how the economics were all interrelated. 30, we have trade wars. Back in the 80s, the Japanese looked like they were going to be the dominant global power, economic power, and the U.S. was on decline, and there were massive trade wars, and how corporations looked at where they were going to invest. That made a huge difference. In 31, we had 1989, we had Charles Keating, who was kind of the face of the savings and loan fiasco here in the United States, which again changed the face of risk management and from a government standpoint and regulation. 32, we have the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska, which again changes once more the idea of corporate responsibility, and in fact lawsuits are still being argued about that case. 33, we have just a massive change in terms of the Berlin Wall drops, and now globalization really starts to take hold. 34, we have in 1989 the book published by Barry Boehm on software risk management, and that changes kind of how risk management ought to be done in the IT community. My own book, 35, which was also published in 1989 on software engineering, risk analysis, and management, starts to pull together this idea of IT risk management into the corporation. 36, the machine that changed the world, really documenting lean manufacturing and changing fundamentally the whole idea of risk in the manufacturing community. Massive change, sea change that occurred in the late 80s and early 90s because of Japanese car manufacturing. 37, kind of a wake-up call in terms of the technical community where you had the AT&T network outage, which just really showed the fragility of systems which were thought to be incredibly reliable. 38, well, Adrian Cadbury of the Cadbury fortune is asked in the UK to write something about corporate governance because of a number of scandals that had occurred in the late 80s in the UK, but really now starts to formalize this whole idea of corporate governance. 39, I have another book in 1990 that comes out that really sets together kind of the early ideas that underpin enterprise risk management, but from an IT technical perspective. 39, well, you got Michael Hammer's book in 1993, which says, hey, don't pave over the cow path. We're now really looking at re-engineering the corporations. We've changed in fact, how corporations are viewed. Instead of being a benevolent employer, now it's kind of like everyone's on their own. The loyalty changes. 40 is another book that I helped author in the UK this time, 1993, that really sets out the framework for enterprise risk management. 41, a person named James Land in 1993 coins the term Chief Risk Officer, which really comes out of the financial community, which says, well, now we need to really think about managing risk across the corporation. I know there's a lot of events here, and you'll have to bear with me. We only got 2 more slides. But again, I think as you can see as I'm talking, how each one of these events changes enterprise risk management and some of the underpinnings of risk management, what's considered risk and what should be controlled, and at one time was outside control, now is becoming internal control. 42, here's an event at Barings Bank, a bank that's been around for several hundred years, one that's thought to have really good risk control internally. They have a rogue trader that basically brings down the bank. 43, well, now all of a sudden the face of terrorism really takes hold. Now in 93, there's the First World Trade Center bombing. That kind of goes and comes and goes, doesn't really make a big impact, but the Oklahoma City bombing really does, because now we have this idea of domestic terrorism here in the United States. On 44, about the year 1995, we have this idea of value at risk, which all of a sudden says, well, here's an algorithm for corporations to use to take a look at how much risk they're actually carrying on in their corporations. Really kind of a early days of the algorithmic approach to understanding and doing risk investment at a corporate level. 45, also in 1995, the Chinese economy really starts to take hold as China really starts to break its bond from heavy-handed communism to kind of this economic communism, and it begins its rise as a global economic power. 46, that's also in 1996. We have another National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering book called Understanding Risk, which really starts to document risk communication and what that means. 47, also in 96, is a book by a person, the Business Week editor, economics editor, Michael Mandel, called The High Risk Society, which is an early warning to saying, I hate to tell you, but that risk in the economy, because of globalization, has changed, and it's going to be those who can manage risk best are the ones who are going to survive. In 48, you may not be able to make this out, but what this is a hole in the ground in the Everglades caused by value jet crash outside of Miami, which, again, part of the idea of the 90s was the deregulation of the airlines, the 80s into the 90s, and low-cost airlines, and how far can the government not manage risk in terms of regulation. 49, well, 1997, 98, we get into this period where now we worry about Y2K. 50, Global risk, well, here we have long-term capital management in 1998, just about taking down the whole economic world markets because of large bets based on algorithmic approaches, which now calls that into question. 1998 as well, we have Peter Bernstein's book, Against the Gods, which now brings risk management out to the forefront. When I was doing risk management in the late 80s, early 90s, and you talk about risk in corporations, they'd say, what? Well, after Peter's book, people weren't asking that question anymore. They were looking at it much more seriously. 52, well, again, the year 1998, we have everybody getting rich off the .com, and then in 53, in the year 2000, everything going hell in a handbasket. About this time, in 54, 2001, we put out the chair of, I was the chair of the IEEE and ISO standard on, first standard on software risk management comes out. 55, we have Enron, and that whole fiasco. 56, we have the I love you worm, which really changes everybody's opinion about IT security and says to people, well, maybe this is important. 57, World Trade Center, well, we all know what happened to the management of risk when that occurred. All you have to do is fly, and you'll see that throughout the day that you're on your trip. 58, in 2002, we have the signing of Starbucks and this whole idea of compliance. 59, we had the first big models pulled together by the financial community in terms of an enterprise risk management model. In 60, well, we have the Columbia disaster, and now it highlights this idea that after Challenger, NASA, an engineering organization, one that now had a soft risk management culture, hardens it up, and then over time it atrophies again. And we now start to understand that risk management does atrophy if it isn't actively managed every day. 61, well, we have the Iraqi and Afghanistan wars, and again, how that changes risk management and what risks are assumed and which ones are controllable comes to fore. And again, as I move on to the next and final slide, and I'm sorry if I'm boring you with all these, but if you're a student of the game, each of these events changes how risk is viewed and how we need to manage it. We get into 62 with Facebook, this whole idea of social media. That's in 2004. That's 7 years ago. 63, we have the 787, Boeing changing how you do supply chain management in a high-tech area. And in fact, I was just reading this morning about with the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, Boeing is now very worried about how it's going to manage that supply chain because it has a big part of the fuselage elements is being done in Japan. 64, we have actually the second book, actually the second edition of this book called Irrational Exuberance, which was first published about 8 years before, which worried about the .com revolution. Now worried about the irrational exuberance in the home market area. 65, well, we got Katrina in 2005, and we know that just changed and highlighted the lack of risk management in government in dealing with crises here in the United States. In 66, we have Mr. Paulson from Goldman, who's called Mr. Risk, coming to Washington trying to help the Bush administration manage risk from the financial markets because it doesn't quite understand what's going on in this massively increased marketplace that's going on. In 67, we have the stock market in 2007 hitting 14,000 plus and just having a massive run-up unlike anything seen before, and books coming out saying Dow Jones 36,000. And what does that mean with people being people as well as corporations being over-leveraged? 68, well, here you have the iPhone coming out. And the iPhone, just in the past 4 years has just phenomenally changed telecommunications and the management of risk in that industry. So you have a whole risk change. 69, you have the book, The Black Swan, talking about low likelihood but extremely catastrophic events that occur and how those aren't being managed. And now the marketplace in 2007, going into 2008, showing that people aren't able to manage the risk on the edges. 71, just some USB flash drives, and this area of security risk coming to the fore, where DoD the U.S. Department of Defense is penetrated tremendously by USB drives that are infected and getting into the network. 72, well, once again, another rogue trader just causes massive problems within a banking community, and showing again, even though risk management controls are there, we need to take a look even further and think more about behaviors. 73, well, Lehman Bank, along with a whole host of others, have problems. Lehman goes under and just about takes out the whole financial market. 74, the former Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, admitting that, well, maybe they didn't really understand what was going on. Their risk management wasn't very clear. 75, Countrywide, just one of the mortgage companies that really pushed hard to sell mortgages, grant mortgages to people who really didn't have the wherewithal, but they didn't care because they could make a lot of money. Or as Charles Prince at Citibank had said, as long as the music's playing, you got to keep dancing. 76, well, you get the Dow Jones down in the 6,000s, a massive drop, and a worry that it may go further. 77, which is in 2009, you get ISO 31000. Which is the first standard that takes a look at kind of an enterprise risk management approach and how that now starts to come into play. 78, well, we got the BP disaster from last year. 79 also from last year. WikiLeaks, again, another view of how you have to manage risk within an organization in terms of your data. 80, just from a few weeks ago, the change in Egypt and in Algeria, now the fights in Libya. And what I don't have, as you see, is I don't have the Japanese event. So that's in a very quick, and I know it's kind of a fire hose approach of all the different events that have changed enterprise risk management and the thinking of enterprise risk management, and showing the complexity of all the different things. You take any handful of those, of which I've written about and lots of other people in Qatar have written about. There's papers about risk management in almost every one of these areas that you can read, each one changing the view and the perception of risk and how it needs to be managed, and as I said before, risks that were thought not to be part of your control set now having to be part of your control set. Now what you see if you take a look at these events is that you see a serial management of risk failure that have occurred. In almost every place where there's been a surprise, the risks were not well articulated or anticipated, and when they were generally ignored, which again is some people say that's not a fault of enterprise risk management, but if you can't get people to pay attention to it, well, then it's a failure. Most of the risks were much broader and more integrated than expected, and I can go back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and in every one of those events you'll see that same thing over and over and over again. Another problem you'll see is that the consequences were aggregated, the details were missing. People really kind of looked at kind of a risk financing perspective rather than looking and saying, well, what are the underlying fundamentals that we're changing? If we take a look at the financial meltdown, we see that in spades. People really didn't dig deep into, say, the mortgages and how they were being packaged to understand what those problems were. I've wrote about that before it happened, not to blow my own horn, but myself and a whole bunch of others wrote about it, and were pretty much dismissed as being out of our minds, being Cassandras, and now we look like geniuses, but it was all there for anybody to see. Risk turned into problems, crises much more quickly than expected. People really have underestimated how quickly things turn, and as you have an integrated environment, that always happens. In fact, one of the rules of risk management is you really need to understand the interfaces that you are faced with. The more interfaces, the more risk, the harder it is going to be control and understand. Control efforts were always optimism-based. Human nature, we really don't look at the behaviors. We keep creating unintended consequences because we don't think through how people are going to react to these changes. risk assessments in lots of corporations are still seen as blame analysis. We haven't been able to overcome that, and you know, probably my sum up is hope has triumphed over experience in almost every place in terms of thinking about risk and managing it. Now, enterprise risk management, you know, hasn't stood still. If you take a look over time, and hopefully you've been able to see these, the systems of interest, what again we considered an area of importance once is now a subset of a major area of importance. That's why we have strategic, operational, financial, insurance, crisis, and social risk. Each one of those areas has expanded. We've tried to integrate processes from all those different disciplines into some type of whole. There's been a move over the last decade plus to change the definition of risk. Part of it is to make risk sound more palatable to senior management ears because, again, no one really, if you say the word risk, people really kind of shy away from that. And there's also been much more in terms of mandating risk management. But in all these cases, my personal opinion is that risk management, and enterprise risk management in particular, continues to disappoint. We tend to keep doing the same things over and over again. I don't know, you know, we can keep integrating till the cows come home. We can expand our view, but unless we can really attack a fundamental, we're going to be in this paradox where we need risk management, but nobody really believes in it very much. We'll be in this, as a lot of risk managers in corporations are finding, they're kind of like this, we'll assess risk for food position. So the big roadblock I see is that behaviors are generally ignored. What's in it for me? In fact, if you read about what's happening in Japan, there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of accusations that the risks were not managed well in the nuclear reactor areas by the companies over there, that they were hiding things. And in fact, you'll see a lot of that in the press right now. So what's in it for me? Well, I'm going to talk very quickly here in the next 10 minutes or so about a company that I've written about quite a bit for Qatar, Rockwell Collins, who I think has understood this and has gotten it right. Part of it is some of the work I've helped them with, but a lot of it is what they've done on their own there. I helped start a risk management program back in 1990, 91 there. We did it the old-fashioned way. We concentrated on processes, training, getting people up to speed. And what we found in Collins, which is out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and was and is a hard-nosed engineering company, is that the engineers and managers were very unimpressed with what we were doing. What they looked at risk management, and especially as we started moving it across the corporation, as what's in it for me? You're asking me to do a lot more of these things. You're asking me to predict what might go wrong, and all I see is a lot more work. And if you talked, and when we did talk to the engineers and the managers, you had this whole range of emotions. You had managers saying, "What? If I highlight these risks, that means you're telling me my program's going to fail." Or I'm an engineer. We manage risk well. We're successful, and at the time, Collins was a successful company. But they were at a crossroads themselves, a risk crossroads, where they were moving from an electrical engineering company in avionics to one that was software-driven. People would say, "What risk? We don't have risk. We have challenges." And others who just said, "Look, there's no value in this. I'll take the risks that I want to take, and I'll manage those as well as we can." The risk management team and senior management, luckily at Collins, we got the support of the very senior executive office, had to rethink the position away from processes to something else. And that focus was really on behaviors toward risk. We really spent a lot of time, and I worked a lot with two folks, Dr. Pat O'Brien, who's a senior program manager there today, and Art Gemmer, who passed away a few years ago, but it was also a Qatar consultant. We focused a lot on trying to understand why people had these negative reactions toward risk and what could we do about it. And I'm not going to go through these, but you can see really, I've talked about this, risk is emotive. It didn't seem to solve today's problem. It looked like second guessing. And if you took a look at risk management and the priority of all the processes, well, cost, schedule, regulatory requirements, program requirements, quality, all came before risk management. there just was no way to get people to really think that risk management was anywhere on that list of priorities. So one of the things we did is we did some cultural assessments there. We actually we spent quite a bit of time, and I had been doing this at some other organizations as well, to try to look at, okay, well, how do people view risk, and then what behaviors do we see? So these were kind of the major cultural rules that people use in their decision making. Was one is to be risk averse. Okay, you didn't get any brownie points for sounding like a Cassandra by bringing up risks, and so people would let risks foster into turn into problems, and then you could deal with them because no one would argue with you about whether or not something was there or not. Also, if you brought up risk, it would imply that decision was wrong. So again, it made people look bad. It was easier to be reactive because you could deal with the symptoms rather than the causes. No one would ask for risk information because, again, if you did, you'd likely get shot in a lot of cases. No news is good news, as most of us know. Again, it wasn't easy because if you had risk, you were telling people, well, things might not happen. So, managers would say, well, if it might not happen, it might not happen. So why spend money to try to keep something that might not happen from happening? And like most organizations, there was a lot of heroes in Collins in the early 90s, and people just said if you have problems or if you have these risks, the solution was to work harder. So what happened is we kind of came across this idea of saying, well, risk management, you can't tell people, well, don't do certain things. What we need to do is actually tell people to have functional behaviors. So we concentrated on creating these reinforcing functional behaviors, how you should behave in the face of risk. We started attacking each one of these, and we really got managers involved. And as I said, we were a little bit lucky in that we had senior management support. And we started to say, really probably in my mind the key was getting managers to ask for risk information. Because if it became valued by the managers, then it became valued by the engineers. And what was real important was to get the engineers to understand it wasn't the fact that we were trying to get them not to take risks, but it was to try to take quality risks. Because it was now important to take these quality risks not only at the engineering end, but also from sales and marketing all the way through bid, proposal, and delivery. And as I said, there's a series of papers as well as a long report on this in detail that you can read if you'd like. We created these functional behaviors by setting up these different levers, pushes and pulls. We came up with these risk principles, processes, and training. Risk was now treated as an asset that was to be exploited, both in terms of making sure that bad risks didn't happen and good risks were able to be turned into innovations. Decision-making was viewed as a skill. Again, I doubt very many of you in the audience have had formalized decision training, but again, what is it that you do as a manager but to make decisions concerning risk? As I said, we created this big pull for risk information. The other thing is that we really made it important that the senior managers understand that their enterprise risk management was only as good as the data they were getting at the project level. So we really started looking at getting risks assessed and managed as a team. We calculated a return on investment, probably the only calculation that I know of that's actually been done that had real data showing that programs that were using risk management were much more successful in terms of cost and schedule than those that didn't. And again, I'll be more than happy to talk about those to anyone about how we did that. Risk management now started to receive very positive support at the most senior levels of the company. Now, what was interesting, one of the things that really sold risk management and enterprise risk management was a crisis that occurred to Collins back in the year 2001 when the World Trade Center got hit by the aircraft, by the terrorists. Collins had just gone public. It had been spun off from Rockwell International. It was very vulnerable. It had been spun off just a few weeks before, and then 9/11 hit, and all of a sudden its business dropped tremendously because the airlines canceled order after order after order for avionics and other products that Rockwell provided, and they saw a drop of potential revenue of somewhere, I believe, around 30% in an afternoon. Well, enterprise risk management helped them get their business back in place, had a new strategic plan in place within a week, and helped them really manage through that crisis to the point where they were named, best managed company in aerospace within a very short span of years. I think within 3 years after that point. It also helped them manage major programs, got them major program wins. When Sarbox came out in 2002, it was a non-issue because enterprise risk management had already been looking at compliance and governance. And again, the senior management from the CEO to the board all the way down viewed it as a very valuable thing. And these are quotes from some of the managers there. Risk management is not a program or a process, but part of the corporate DNA. Sees issues they hadn't seen, allows us to really own our customers' problems, which is one of the really fascinating aspects of enterprise risk management when you do it well, that you get to help your customers. And in fact, there's really no policy for risk management there. It just is within the organization. I believe that this behavior view, which is the thing that's really this missing piece in enterprise risk management and seems to be ignored by the suppliers of enterprise risk management, both in terms of consultancy as well as in terms of products, is this thing that will help us overcome this paradox that we're finding. It's always, if risk management is viewed as a process or an algorithm or just some control function, it's never really going to make very much difference because it has to impact everyday decision making. It has to impact how people behave, what they view and value as important. So you have to consider these organizational behaviors, and unfortunately there's no one size fits all. That's another aspect. You can't just take the latest product off the shelf, some enterprise risk management product, plug it in and expect the behaviors to change. It really takes some effort and some thought about, well, what drives people away from doing risk management well. You have to create these functional behaviors. You really have to understand the cultures. You have to understand the sheer size. You really need to think through all these aspects. It's hard work. It's not something that you can just do very quickly. And you have to think again about behaviors, about what you want people to do. How do you want them to make decisions? You also, again, it's critical that you master the details, you master the risk. I'll tell you, there's so many times where assumptions fail, the contexts aren't considered. There's a phenomenal book by a person named Phil Rosenweg. It's called The Halo Effect. It came out a few years ago. It talks about why process improvement, any process improvement program is likely to fail, and why just because it works in one organization doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work in your own. Again, you have to master those details, master the context. And I think you really need to publicize the value of risk management, both professionally and personally. You have to be a student of the game. You have to understand all those things. The events might have bored you to tears, but go back, take any one of those, dig into it a little bit, and see how risks were managed or weren't managed, and how today it may be obvious that some of those risks should have been managed, should have been obvious, and you can ask yourself, why weren't they? I'm going to leave off now. We have a couple minutes left for questions if anybody want to ask. But this is always the last slide I have. It's kind of a slide that's pretty common in the risk field. It's a derivative from something that Peter Drucker said a long time ago. But managing risk doesn't deal with future decisions, but the future or present decisions. Everything about enterprise risk management is about making better decisions today, not about the future. It's about what we need to do. Hopefully, I've given you a broad view of enterprise risk management, why it has a lot of potential, but why it also, that potential, continues to not live up to the expectations that people have for it. I'd read a lot about Collins. If you're interested in this, you can talk to me about Collins. There's tons and tons of papers on the Cutter website on risk management. We've been doing this for a long time. We probably have more papers on risk management than any other group. Especially in the IT community. I know that for a fact. I know, we've started the practice over a decade ago. We have, I don't know how many papers we have. Mark probably could tell you, but I know it's well in the hundreds that deal with all different aspects, all these, many of these events. And, I want to thank you for listening. I know you probably are having to tune away from what's going on in Japan. Look at what's happening there. that's another event that's going to have massive impact on enterprises and how they need to think about risk and how you need to manage it yourself. And with that, I'm going to end and turn it back on to Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. At this point, we would like to move to the Q&A session. To ask a question, just type it into the bar at the bottom of the Questions for Bob pod and then click on the speech balloon to the right of that bar. So we do have time for a few questions, and I think this first one might be the most relevant, speaking of what Bob ended up with. And how will recent events like Japan's earthquake, the social upheaval in the Middle East, and the possibility of one or more countries in the European Union, how is that going to impact enterprise risk management?
Well, for one, it's going to really get people to think how they're going to integrate, strategic, operational, and financial risk management. We've seen in Japan the issues of operational risk management, continuity management, that whole area. I think every business right now is taking a look at its continuity management plans. Those who have big supply chains are probably thinking through about how they're going to manage those, not only if they have supply chains that stretch into Japan, but others that don't. I think there's going to be a wholesale rethinking of enterprise risk management in the wake of the Japanese disaster. I think that what's happening in Europe and in the Middle East, I think social risk management, especially in terms of social media, that's an area of enterprise risk management that has only, the surface is only being scratched at right now. There's a whole area there to explore. I don't think anybody really understands WikiLeaks. I think if you just view it as a security issue, that really narrows it way too much. I think what's happening in Europe in terms of potentially the global financial meltdown that may create on top of what's happening in Japan. I think right now enterprise risk management is going to be on the lips of everyone, but at the same time, as I said, I think that there's this again paradox in terms of we know we need to do this, but we really don't know how valuable it's going to be. So I think the impacts are going to, it's going to be many months of thinking and speculation as to what's going to happen. In fact, I'll be writing about it for this coming week's email advisor for Qatar.
Thank you, Bob. I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. And why are most top-down approaches to enterprise risk management bound to fail?
Well, I think, again, and this is what I've seen for the most part, where enterprise risk management comes into a company, you have senior management declaring that you're going to do it, and off you go. And I think the biggest reason is, again, enterprise risk management from a top-down doesn't really worry about the behaviors very much. It's pretty much a push down into the organization. It doesn't answer that fundamental question of the worker on the ground of, well, what does this do for me? How does this help my job better? It looks a lot like blame analysis. And again, without that detail, without a flow, right? Enterprise risk management is by definition holistic. It moves up and moves down, moves sideways. Without a flow of risk information across the enterprise, it's bound to fail. And that flow is never going to happen if you can't answer that fundamental question of what's in it for me and how did that behavior get changed. So people are not risk averse. They're really, risk communicative. They want to communicate that information. They have what Peter Drucker called information responsibility. Their senior management value that information, and they're not going to use it as a club. So I think if you push it down, you use it with tools, you're bound to fail. I've only seen one company who has ever been able to put it in top down, and they still struggle with it as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. Well, on behalf of everyone at Qatar, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you have further questions or comments about the content presented in today's webinar, we encourage you to call or email Bob at rcharette@qatar.com. Please visit qatar.com and go to the events section where you can register for other upcoming webinars and